The room where you are born does not smell of industrial soot. It smells of turned earth, wet wool, and the sharp, clean bite of a Berkshire winter. It is 1853. You were born in a thatched roof cottage, miles away from the iron pulse of London. Your father is an agricultural laborer, his hands permanently stained with the soil he plows but will never own. When you are born, there are no celebrations. A daughter here is simply another mouth to feed, and eventually another pair of hands to send out into the world to earn their keep. They name you Mary. England is changing, and your world is about to shrink. One evening, when you are 7, your father comes home carrying his scythe over one shoulder. He leans it against the whitewashed wall. He doesn't sharpen it. He doesn't clean it. He simply sits by the hearth and puts his head in his hands. Your mother doesn't ask why. She already knows. She looks out the dark window toward the valley and whispers, "They're putting sheep on our fields." The next morning, your mother ties rough twine around your sleeves so they won't catch on the brambles. She kisses the top of your head, her lips chapped and cold. Don't let the crows frighten you, Mary. By sunset, you are standing in the freezing, muddy furrows, clapping 2 wooden boards together for 12 hours a day. Your hands turn red, then purple, then split open from the frost. You earn 4 pence a week, handing every coin straight to your mother. By the time you are 14, the softness of childhood is gone. Your father finds you a place through the hiring fair. You are to be a scullery maid for a merchant's family in Reading. The day you leave, your mother wraps a loaf of bread in a clean rag and hands you a small pewter thimble, the only thing of value she owns. She kisses your forehead. You do not know it then, but you will never see her again. The merchant's house is a 3-story brick building where you sleep in the cellar on a sack of straw next to the coal bunker. Your day begins at 4 in the morning, hauling heavy scuttles of coal and scrubbing pots with harsh soda lye that peels the skin from your knuckles in thick strips. You are invisible. For 4 long years, you endure the aching back and the isolation. But by the autumn of your 18th year, the grand house begins to change. The household grows quieter. The mistress sells 3 silver candelabras, leaving empty dark patches on the sideboard wallpaper. Fires burn in fewer rooms, and the coal scuttles you carry upstairs are strictly rationed. Thick letters arrive daily with unfamiliar wax seals, and the older servants whisper near the pantry about creditors and failed stock. When the collapse finally comes, it feels entirely inevitable. The master flees his debts, the house is locked by the bailiffs, and you are cast into the street with your final week's wages, but no letter of reference. You stand on the steps in the rain. You are 18. You have no character reference, which means no respectable household in Reading will ever hire you. You cannot go back to your village to be another burden. You walk to the railway station, use your last coins, and buy a 3rd-class ticket to London. You wander east into the rookeries of Street Giles, a labyrinth of narrow alleys and open sewers where 20 people sleep on a lodging house floor for 2 pence a night. You spend weeks searching the grand houses in Bloomsbury for a day's scrubbing, but the cooks see your pale, gaunt face, note the lack of a reference, and slam the doors. As twilight falls, you stand beneath a gas lamp on Oxford Street for nearly an hour, watching women in bright silk dresses, laughing as gentlemen slip silver into their palms. Twice you begin walking toward Paddington Station, thinking you can run away or go home. Twice, you stop. You reach into your pocket and pull out what you have left, 4 pennies. Not even enough for another night on the lodging house floor. You look down at your split boots, look back at the women in the silk, and make your choice. You turn around and walk back to the lodging house. The old woman who runs the lodgings is waiting by the hearth. She looks at your empty hands and smiles. "Don't worry, Flower. I know a lady over in the Haymarket, Mrs. Jeffries. She'll give you a proper room and fine clothes." The next morning, she leads you across London to a townhouse on a quiet side street near the theaters. The parlor is filled with plush red velvet furniture and the thick scent of lavender water and stale gin. Mrs. Jeffries, a woman dressed in expensive black silk with gold rings on nearly every finger, circles you slowly. She checks your teeth and runs a firm hand down your waist. "The gentlemen do love a country girl," she says, signaling a servant to bring down a red satin gown. As the fabric falls over your shoulders, you look toward the door, but Mrs. Jeffries catches your gaze and laughs. "Run away if you like, Flower. Walk outside wearing my silk and the constable won't ask where you got it. He'll ask who you stole it from. You are trapped by the very clothes on your back." An older girl named Martha steps into the dressing room while the bouncer is downstairs. She uses a piece of broken vanity glass to slice a small tear in the inner lining of your new corset stays, whispering a vital secret. This is where you hide the copper tokens the patrons tip you. If the madam finds them during morning inspections, she'll lock you in the cellar. The iron chime of the parlor clock marks 9. You line up against the mahogany wainscoting with 5 other women, while the laughter of drunken theatergoers drifts up from the bar below. Your knees shake. You look down at the floor, your heart pounding against your ribs, until you force your own feet flat against the wood, bracing yourself as the door opens. A wealthy merchant in a velvet coat steps forward. He stops in front of you, lifting your chin with a gloved finger. "What's your name, girl?" he asks, his breath heavy with port wine. Your tongue catches on the roof of your mouth. For a second, the cottage in Berkshire flashes through your mind. You open your lips to say, "Mary." But before the word can form, Martha steps half a pace forward, her face a mask of practiced charm. "Her name is Rose, sir," Martha says smoothly, dipping into a low curtsy. "A fresh country rose, just arrived for the season." The gentleman nods, satisfied, and tosses 3 silver shillings onto the velvet table. Mrs. Jeffries sweeps the coins into her apron pocket, signals you with a sharp nod, and turns away. Upstairs, after the heavy footsteps have finally retreated down the dark hallway, you sit on the edge of the mattress and look at the wash basin. Martha slips into the room carrying a pitcher of warm water. She dips a rag into the basin and gently wipes the smeared rouge from your cheek. "Never give them the name your mother used," Martha whispers, her voice flat and fiercely quiet. "Mary belongs to the cottage. Mary belongs to the parish. If you let them touch Mary, there won't be anything left of you to go home to. Out here, you are Rose. Rose can take the blows. Mary stays safe inside." The seasons blur into a cycle of winter sleet and coal smoke. The gas jets stay lit day and night because the windows are boarded up to keep the girls from signaling the street police. You adapt quickly, out of survival. When a drunken patron tears your sleeve, you don't weep. You instantly steal a needle from the parlor maid and spend the small hours of the morning mending the stitch yourself, ensuring Mrs. Jeffries never sees the damage. Yet, there are moments where the machine pauses. On a freezing evening in January, a client climbs the stairs to your room. As he pulls off his heavy coat, a sudden, violent fit of coughing racks your chest, leaving you gasping against the headboard. The man stops. He looks at the blood-flecked rag in your hand, then at your hollow cheeks. He doesn't offer comfort, and he doesn't light a fire. He simply grimaces with a cold, transactional distaste, throws 2 shillings onto the wash basin so his night isn't completely wasted, and walks back out to find a healthier girl downstairs. When the door clicks shut, you realize it's the first time in months you've been left entirely alone in the dark. You close your eyes and sleep. Later that year, while the parlor is empty, you lead the girls up to the slate roof. You sit shoulder to shoulder on the soot-covered stone, sharing a single bruised peach you managed to hide in your apron, watching the moon rise over St. Paul's. For 10 minutes, listening to the distant clip-clop of hansoms. The ledger doesn't exist. You laugh, and for a moment, you are human. Then, the sharp yank of the kitchen bell wire rattles from below. The magic evaporates. You pull your shawl tight, smear another layer of toxic white lead powder over your dark eye circles to mask the exhaustion, and walk back down into the parlor. By your 24th year, your fingers begin to twist and tremble, a condition the local apothecaries call cosmetic palsy. The heavy white makeup you apply every night is bound with pure white lead. Over time, the skin absorbs the poison, paralyzing the muscles in your wrists and turning your complexion a sickly, translucent gray. The stakes inside the district turn lethal as rumors drift from the port towns of new laws, whispers of plainclothes inspectors, and the terrifying threat of being dragged to forced medical examinations at the Lock Hospital if anyone suspects you are carrying the rot. One afternoon, you find Martha in the washroom, frantically wrapping a linen rag around a deep, weeping sore on her wrist. The system is unyielding. If Mrs. Jeffries sees that mark, Martha will be thrown into the rain before nightfall to die in a charity ward. You look at Martha's begging eyes, the girl who saved your name on your very first night. You reach into your corset stays, pull out the hidden copper tokens you've spent months saving, and slip them into her palm for medicine. You carry her shift to the laundry, wash the blood from the linen yourself, and keep your mouth shut. But time is an unfeeling creditor. By your late 20s, the lead poison and the consumption have taken your breath, and you spend your nights coughing into a rag stained with red. Mrs. Jeffries doesn't call for a physician. That would require spending capital on an asset that can no longer draw a crowd. One rainy morning, the bouncer takes you by the elbow, leads you down the back steps, and leaves you in the morning drizzle of the court with nothing but a frayed flannel petticoat and your broken boots. Your name is crossed out of the tally book with a single stroke of Mrs. Jeffries' steel pen. You sit on a rotting crate near the river wharves, watching the black coal barges cut through the gray water of the Thames. You realize the only real flowers you ever saw in that house were the wax ones under glass in the parlor, kept pristine for the buyers, while the living ones were discarded the moment the petals bruised. You look down at your scarred hands, realizing you never truly owned a single hour of the life that began in that Berkshire cottage. If you walk down Haymarket today, the townhouse is gone, replaced by a concrete office block and the rush of modern traffic. The parish registries never noted your passing, and the Victorian newspapers never printed your name. But if you visit the basement archives of the London Museum, behind a sheet of reinforced glass sits a single pair of mid-19th century linen stays, recovered from an old brick well. The museum label identifies them simply as weavers or domestic linen stays, c. 1860. It doesn't mention the hidden, uneven stitches inside the lining or the girl who sewed them there, hoping to buy her way back into the light.